Welcome to my series of basketball videos where I'll be comparing various NBA grades against each other. I'm doing this because I find that a lot of the basketball videos comparing players on YouTube are too focused on the big names, and sometimes compare players from different positions. For example, lots of people compare Jordan to LeBron and Kobe to Duncan, just because of their similar levels of achievements, but since those players play different positions and have different styles of play, it's not an interesting comparison. In this series, I want to do a comparison not between just more well-known players, but players from days past, in the 1960s, 1970s, 1980s, and even the ABA as well, that most modern fans probably do not have too much knowledge about. Also, as much as possible, I want to compare players that play similar positions and have similar play styles. To me, that's a more interesting and fruitful comparison. I'll be using 6 different metrics to compare each player. The first category is scoring. This category will be defined by each player's career points per game, peak points per game both in the regular season and playoffs, and number of scoring titles. Rebounding. This category will be defined by each player's career rebounds per game, peak rebounds per game both in the regular season and playoffs, and number of rebounding titles. Passing. This category will be defined by each player's career assists per game, peak assists per game both regular season and playoffs, and number of assist titles. Efficiency and advanced metrics. This category will be defined by each player's career true shooting percentage per and win shares per 48, both in the regular season and playoffs. The reason I use true shooting percentage is because it's more fair to guards. Field goal percentage tends to be biased to big men because of their height and play style closer to the basket. I also put in win shares per 48 here because it encompasses efficiency along with other attributes to give you an idea of how many wins a player contributes to his team. Defense. This category will be defined by each player's all defensive selections, defensive win shares, and defensive player of the year awards. The reason I'm not using blocks and steals in this comparison is because I want to compare the achievements of older players that modern fans might not have too much knowledge about, and players in the 1960s and early 1970s do not have steals and blocks tracked. Awards. This category will be defined by All-Star appearances, All-NBA selections, MVPs, Finals MVPs, and championships as the first, second, or third best player. The reason I have to only count championships as a top 3 player on the team is because otherwise you get into the situation where, for example, Robert Horry has 7 rings and Karl Malone has 0, and it's not representative of how much better a player is if they weren't a top 3 player on their team contributing to a championship. I know including All-Star selections is a little bit controversial because it's fan voted, but ultimately this is what the Hall of Fame uses in their criteria to induct a player, as unfair as it sounds. Also, I'll be including ABA stats and awards and using them as equivalent to their respective NBA stats and awards. The only one that's different about the ABA is that instead of Finals MVP, they have Playoffs MVP, which honestly is a better idea than Finals MVP since it accounts for the whole playoffs, but just to keep it simple, I'll be referring to the ABA Playoffs MVP as Finals MVP here. Also, no All-NBA third team selections are counted, because All-NBA third teams weren't added until the late 80s, which is unfair to older players. Also, I'm not using any career total stats because that's a longevity thing. For example, no one would say that Karl Malone was a better scorer than Michael Jordan, even though he has more total points. And of course, this is only going to be my opinion from comparing the available metrics, since I have not watched most of these players live, or even been born when some of these players have been playing. And to keep it fair, I'm judging them based on how they did in their own era. No time travel or what if this NBA player played in today's era or the 1960s, none of that. I'll be strictly basing their stats and accomplishments within their own era against that era's competition, which makes the most sense to me. So I hope you guys enjoy this comparison video and hopefully learn something new from it. The 4th episode compares 2 all-time underrated 1970s centers who tend to be left out of a lot of all-time discussions. Willis Reed is best known as the captain and leader of the New York Knicks during their most successful dynasty in the early 70s, and Mel Daniels is the mostly forgotten, underrated captain and engine of the dominant Indiana Pacers dynasty of the ABA, the most successful franchise in that league. Both players only played 9 seasons, but had incredible intangibles and hustle, which caused their teammates to look up to them. But who is the greater player of the two? Let's find out. In the scoring category, neither player was a particularly gifted scorer, and their scoring averages are very close, with Willis Reed averaging 18.7 points per game for his career, peaking at 21.7 in 1970, and 17.4 points per game in the playoffs, peaking at 27.5 in 1967. Mel Daniels averaged 18.4 points per game for his career, peaking at 24 per game in 1969, and 17.4 points per game in the playoffs, peaking at 25.3 in 1968. While both players had nice scoring numbers in some playoff series, overall it's fairly close, as both players did most of their damage from the low mid-range and post. Both Reed and Daniels were often the secondary or even third offensive options on their teams, and neither have a particular scoring edge over the other, so this category is a tie. In this category, both players were great rebounders for their era. Reed put up 12.9 rebounds per game for his career, peaking at 14.7 per game in 1965, and 10.3 rebounds per game in the playoffs, peaking at 14.1 boards per game in 1969. Reed was a solid hustle rebounder for his time, at a level perhaps just below Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, Wilt Chamberlain, Wes Unseld, Walt Bellamy, Jerry Lucas, Dave Cowens, and Nate Thurmond, but around the same level as Zelma Beatty, Dave DeBusschere, and Bob Lanier, all Hall of Famers. Mel Daniels, however, was a dominant rebounder in the ABA. He averaged 14.9 rebounds for his career, peaking at an incredible 18 per game in 1971, and 14.8 rebounds per game for the playoffs, peaking at a ridiculous 19.2 per game in the 1971 playoffs. Not only did he lead the league in rebounding 3 times, but he's also the ABA's all-time leading rebounder. Now you could say part of this was due to lack of competition, as the ABA did not have as many all-time rebounders in that era as the NBA had, and Zelma Beatty, Billy Cunningham, and in particular Artis Gilmore would be his main competition, and also keeping in mind the ABA was a bit faster paced than the NBA during that time. But since we are judging each player based on their era and their competition, Mel has to get this category as he was a premier rebounder of his league in his era. In this category, it's totally a wash, as neither player had much passing duties, playing a fairly pure big man role, focusing on post offense, rebounding, and defense. Both Willis and Mel averaged 1.8 assists per game for their careers, Reed averaging slightly higher 1.9 per game in the playoffs compared to Mel's 1.5, but not enough to give him a solid victory. This category is as expected, as distributing was not part of their roles, so this category is also a tie. In the efficiency category, it's also very close, as Reed holds the advantage in win shares per 48 and true shooting percentage, while Mel holds the advantage in per, but neither holds a significant lead over the other in any of these categories. Neither men were particularly good shooters and mostly scored their points down low in the paint or low mid-range, so this category is also a tie. In the defense category, it's also fairly close, as both were very solid interior defenders at their position. Reed has an all-defensive first-team selection, keeping in mind they were not given out until 1969 in the NBA, while Daniels does not have any all-defensive selections but has a lead in defensive win shares. In this category, I also hesitate to say that one was significantly better than the other, so this category is also a tie. In the awards category, both Reed and Daniels have a remarkably similar resume. They both have 7 All-Star appearances. Reed has 2 rings and 3 finals appearances, while Daniels has a total of 3 rings and 5 finals appearances and has 1 more ring and 1 more MVP than Reed. But Reed has 2 finals MVPs, which Mel does not have. Mel has more first-team selections, but we have to keep in mind that the NBA was a lot more talented at the center position at that time compared to the ABA. So Reed having 5 All-NBA selections is actually quite impressive. As with the other categories, neither player has a significant lead over the other. Daniels is perhaps the most forgotten 2-time MVP in the annals of basketball history. So with all that being said, this category is yet another tie. This is perhaps one of the closest comparisons I've ever had to make, as almost every category except for one was a tie. Mel Daniels is one of the most underrated players in history, and most of it's due to the fact that he played the vast majority of his career in the ABA. However, he was a dominant player in the ABA, one of the greatest rebounders of his era, and led a talented, dominant Pacers team full of Hall of Famers to 3 titles in that league. Willis Reed is also an underrated legend that has become more forgotten over time as well. So it was a very interesting exercise to compare these 2 underrated greats. In the end, Mel Daniels pulls out the win by 1 category. I hope you guys enjoyed this comparison. Thanks for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe, and stay tuned for the next comparison video.